The ticket was already in her hand before she understood what it meant. Clara Holloway had been standing in the front parlor of the Holloway house on Dearborn Street for 20 minutes, still in her work apron, flour dusted across her left sleeve from the morning's baking, when her stepmother Helene set the envelope on the table between them and folded her hands with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had long anticipated this moment. "You leave Thursday," Helene said. "The train departs Union Station at 7 in the morning. I've arranged a room at the boarding house until the wedding." Clara looked at the envelope. She didn't pick it up. "What wedding?" "Margaret's wedding." Helene glanced toward the window, as if the answer were somewhere out on the street. Or rather, the wedding that was meant to be Margaret's. It took a moment. Then it settled. "You want me to go in her place? Margaret has accepted a far better offer here in the city." Helene's tone carried no apology, no softening, only the flat efficiency of someone handling logistics. "Mr. Reeves is a banker. His family has property on the North Shore. It would be foolish to let that opportunity pass simply because some railroad foreman in the territory sent letters first. He sent those letters to Margaret. He sent letters to a name." Helene finally looked at her directly. "He has never seen her face. He knows nothing beyond what was written. You are both dark-haired. You are both young women. There is no reason the arrangement cannot proceed as planned." Clara stood very still. Outside, the Chicago street noise continued. A dray horse clopping past, someone calling out from a window above the hardware store, the distant bell of a trolley car. The world carried on with complete indifference to what was being asked of her. "You're telling me to lie to a man about who I am. I'm telling you to fulfill a legal contract that has already been signed." Helene smoothed her skirt. "Margaret's name is on the correspondence, yes, but you will be going as a representative of this family. Once the marriage is recorded, no one will question anything. He will question it the moment he meets me. Then be charming." There was something almost contemptuous in the suggestion. "You've spent enough time making yourself useful around this house. Be useful out there instead." Clara was 23 years old. She had lived in this house since she was 8 when her father brought Helene home 6 months after her mother's death. Too soon, most of the neighbors agreed, though no one said it to his face. In the 15 years since, she had learned to cook, to mend, to manage accounts, to remain quiet when silence was required, and to disappear when her presence was inconvenient. She had watched her half-sisters grow into young women with prospects and beaux and invitations to parties she was never included in. She had told herself for a long time that this was simply how things were, and that things might eventually change. She picked up the envelope. Inside was a train ticket, a brief letter from a man named Wade Mercer, and a clipping from a territorial newspaper advertising for a wife. Sensible, capable, willing to live in a railroad town in the Western Territories. The advertisement was practical to the point of being almost cold. It did not speak of love or companionship in any flowery terms. It asked for a woman who could manage a household, who was not afraid of hard work, who understood that life at the edge of the frontier was not gentle. Margaret's response letters, Clara knew, had promised all of these things. Margaret had been carefully coached by Helene in what to write, because Helene had expected the banker's proposal to arrive before the foreman's and had hedged her bets accordingly. Now the banker had proposed, the train ticket had already been purchased, and Clara was standing in the parlor holding another woman's future. "And if I refuse?" she said. The question was genuine. She honestly did not know what the answer would be. Helene considered her for a moment. "Then you can find your own arrangements. I have been patient with your presence in this house out of respect for your father's memory. That patience is not unlimited." Clara's father had been dead for 2 years. Whatever protection his memory had provided was clearly thinner than she had imagined. She folded the ticket carefully and put it back in the envelope. "Thursday," she said. 7 in the morning, Helene confirmed. "Don't be late. The connection to the Western line is tight." She did not sleep well the 2 nights before she left. She lay in the narrow room at the back of the second floor, the room that had always been hers, small enough that the wardrobe and the bed together consumed nearly all the available floor space, and she stared at the ceiling and tried to reason her way through what she was doing. She was going to impersonate her sister. She was going to marry a man under a false name. She was going to build a life on top of a deception so fundamental that she couldn't imagine any version of events in which it didn't eventually collapse. And yet, she had nowhere else to go. She had no money beyond the few dollars she had saved from the household account over the years. She had no prospects, no education beyond what she had taught herself from whatever books she could borrow, no connections in the city that weren't connected to Helene's household in some way. The women she had grown up watching, the ones with situations, with positions, with lives that were genuinely their own, had started from places very different from this back room on Dearborn Street. She packed her suitcase with great care, choosing the things that were actually useful over the things that might have looked better. 2 dresses, both plain. A wool coat that had seen better days but was still sound. Her sewing kit, because her hands knew how to mend things and she suspected that was worth more, in whatever was coming, than anything else she owned. She packed the letters too. Margaret's letters to Wade Mercer, the ones Helene had kept copies of. If she was going to do this, she needed to know what had been promised, what kind of woman he was expecting, what she had told him about her preferences and her temperament and her past. She spent the last evening reading them over and over until she had them memorized. The woman in those letters was warm and capable and enthusiastic about frontier life, in a way that Clara suspected had been exaggerated for effect. But the core of it, the practicality, the willingness to work, the interest in building something real, that wasn't Margaret at all. That was Clara. Helene had coached Margaret using the qualities she valued in Clara, the ones she'd spent years quietly extracting from her, and in some bitter, sideways fashion, it meant the letters described a woman who was mostly true, except for the name, except for that one essential, irreversible fact. Union Station in the early morning was a different creature than it became later in the day. In the hours before 7, it belonged to the people who had to be somewhere, rather than the people who wanted to be somewhere. The workers, the travelers on long hauls, the families transporting everything they owned westward in search of something they couldn't entirely name. The concourse echoed with the sounds of iron and steam and the announcements of departures, and Clara stood in the middle of it with her suitcase and her envelope and felt like a very small thing in a very large machine. She found her car without difficulty. The seat was hard, the window smudged. The man across the aisle from her fell asleep before the train had cleared the city limits. A woman with 2 young children occupied the seats behind her, and for the first hour Clara listened to the rhythmic, exhausting work of keeping small people content in a confined space and felt something she couldn't name. Not pity exactly, but a kind of recognition. She understood what it was to manage quietly, to smooth things over, to keep the peace, because keeping the peace was what was required. The city fell away by degrees, the neighborhoods gave way to industrial yards, then to farmland, then to something wilder and less organized. Clara watched it all through the smudged window and tried not to think too far ahead. She was going to be Margaret Holloway. She had been practicing the name. Margaret. 2 syllables. She had known a girl named Margaret in school, a red-haired girl who collected birds' nests and had strong opinions about everything. This Margaret would be different. This Margaret would be whoever Wade Mercer needed her to be, at least until Clara could figure out what happened after that. She did not think about what happened after that. The Western Territories in midsummer were nothing like Chicago. The train crossed through landscapes that seemed to grow more emphatic as the miles accumulated. Wider skies, drier air, land that presented itself without apology and without ornamentation. The small towns the train passed through were rough and functional, built for purpose rather than beauty, and in their windows and storefronts, Clara could see evidence of lives that were hard in ways Chicago's hardships weren't. Different scale, different texture. She changed trains twice. At the second connection, in a busy rail junction town, she ate a meal she couldn't quite taste and sat in the station waiting room watching the other travelers and tried to assess what she was walking into. A widowed railroad foreman with a young daughter, a town called Blackstone Junction. Work, presumably. A household to manage and a child to care for, and a husband who had agreed to marry a woman he'd never seen based on a correspondence that wasn't hers. If he was a reasonable man, the truth would destroy everything. If he was unreasonable, it might be worse. She boarded the last train in the early afternoon and dozed fitfully for the better part of the journey, waking to a landscape that had grown starker and more remote, the settlement smaller and farther between, the railroad itself seeming less like infrastructure and more like an assertion. We are here, we exist, we have pressed ourselves into this land, and we are staying. Blackstone Junction announced itself in the late afternoon. The station was modest but solid, a two-story wooden building with a wide platform, a water tower beyond it, and the glint of several rail lines converging in the distance. There were men on the platform, a few women, the ordinary business of a stop on a busy line playing out in real time. Freight was being unloaded. A conductor was consulting something on a clipboard. Two boys chased each other around a luggage cart until a man in a station master's uniform told them to stop. And there, at the far end of the platform, standing slightly apart from the activity, was a man holding the hand of a small girl. Clara knew it was him before she could have explained how she knew. He was tall and solidly built, somewhere in his middle 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that was weathered in the way of men who worked outside in all conditions. He was wearing a clean shirt. She could see it had been freshly pressed, which told her something. And he was watching the train with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. The girl beside him was 7 or 8, small for her age, with her father's dark hair worn in 2 uneven braids that someone had tried to make neat and not entirely succeeded. She was also watching the train, but with less pretense of composure. Her face was openly anxious, openly hopeful, in the way that children's faces were before they learned to guard themselves. Clara stood at the top of the train steps and did not move. She had exactly the time it took to descend those 3 steps to make the most important decision of her life. She could step off and walk toward him and say what she needed to say, and that would be one future. She could stay on the train, although she had no ticket to anywhere else, and no money worth speaking of, and nowhere to go. She stepped off the train. Walking toward him was one of the stranger experiences of her life. The platform noise seemed to recede somehow, the bustle of freight and passengers fading to a kind of background hum, and she was aware of the distance closing between herself and this man she had never met. This man who believed he had been corresponding with her sister for 4 months. This man who was holding his daughter's hand with the particular grip of someone who had learned to hold on to things carefully. He saw her when she was perhaps 30 feet away. She watched him register her, the quick, involuntary assessment that everyone made when meeting a stranger, the brief recalibration. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't disappointment, exactly. It wasn't recognition either, obviously, since he'd never seen her. It was something more neutral, taking stock. "Miss Holloway," he said. The name hit her like a physical thing. Miss Holloway. Her sister's name, her own name too, technically. She was still a Holloway, just not the one he meant. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry for any confusion. I've been traveling 2 days and I'm afraid I'm not quite at my best." It was a deflection, not a lie, but it served to get them past the first moment. "Wade Mercer," he said. He offered his hand and she shook it. His grip was firm but not crushing, the handshake of a man who'd learned to calibrate his own strength. "This is my daughter Lily." The girl was staring at her with an expression that was difficult to parse, not hostile, not welcoming either. Something guarded, something that had been hurt before and was deciding whether this situation warranted further hurt. "Hello, Lily," Clara said. Lily said nothing. She moved slightly closer to her father's side. Clara understood. She didn't push it. "There's a wagon," Wade said. "The house isn't far. Are you hungry? Mrs. Patton at the boarding house usually has supper going by this hour, but I've had some things put together at the house if you'd rather." "The house would be fine," Clara said. She picked up her suitcase before he could reach for it because she'd been carrying her own things for her entire life, and it was a habit that died hard. He noticed. She couldn't tell if he approved or found it odd. They walked off the platform together, the widowed foreman, his silent daughter, and the woman with the wrong name. And Clara kept her eyes forward and told herself that this was survivable, that she had survived harder things, that the shape of a life was not fixed the moment you stepped into it, that things could be adjusted and repaired and made into something better than their beginning suggested. She wasn't sure she believed it, but she held on to it anyway. Well, the house was set back from the main rail line, close enough that the vibration of passing trains was something you felt in the walls rather than just heard. It was a 2-story wooden structure, well built by someone who knew what they were doing, painted a faded blue that had once been darker. There were 3 steps up to the porch. A window box that had something growing in it, though it needed water and the plants were listing to one side with a kind of determined survival. Inside it was clean. That surprised her slightly. Not because she'd expected squalor, but because she'd expected the particular disorder of a man raising a child alone, the corners given over to clutter, the surfaces not quite keeping up with the demand. Instead, the house was organized in the way of someone who had decided that order was load-bearing, that without it something would collapse. The kitchen was functional and serious. The sitting room was spare. The floors were scrubbed. There were no decorative touches to speak of, no curtains with patterns, no ornaments on the mantelpiece. But the absence felt deliberate rather than neglected. "Lily and I can stay elsewhere for a few days if you need," Wade began. "That's not necessary," Clara said. She set her suitcase down by the door and looked around. "I'm not fragile. You don't need to arrange things around me." He looked at her for a moment. "All right." There was a brief, slightly awkward interval in which neither of them quite knew how to proceed. This was, Clara reflected, the fundamental problem with the whole arrangement. The letters had established a certain intimacy, a certain familiarity, and the reality of two strangers standing in a kitchen in a frontier town was something the letters hadn't quite prepared either of them for. "Do you want to see the rest of the house?" he said finally. "Yes," she said. "And then I'd like to know what needs doing." What needed doing was considerable. The house was clean, but it was not comfortable. And it was not comfortable because no one had had the time or attention to make it so. There were curtains that had been washed but never rehung. There was a cold larder that was stocked with practical things, but nothing that suggested anyone was eating with any pleasure. There was a small bedroom off the kitchen that Lily slept in, and the decoration in it, the things a child needs to feel that a space belongs to her, was sparse to the point of absence. There was a single drawing pinned to the wall beside the window, a horse, done in pencil, somewhat better than a child Lily's age might typically produce. Clara stood in the doorway of Lily's room and looked at the drawing for a long moment. "She draws," she said, "when she can find the paper." Wade was behind her. "I don't always think to bring it home." Clara filed this information without comment. Over the following days, she learned the shape of the life she'd entered. Wade worked long hours. The railroad was his livelihood and his primary concern. And the demands on a foreman at a junction this busy were constant. He left before light most mornings and came home in the hours between supper and dark, ate whatever was on the table without complaint, and asked about Lily's day with a thoroughness that suggested the question mattered more to him than his tired face let on. Lily said very little. Not to Clara, not in those first days. She was not rude. She had clearly been raised with the understanding that certain behaviors were not permitted, but she maintained a careful distance, a watchfulness that Clara recognized as self-protective. This was a child who had learned that people arrived and then departed, that attachments were risky, that it was better to wait and see than to invest in something that might not last. Clara was patient. Patience was something she understood. She cooked. She cleaned things that were already clean, in the way of a person who needed occupation. She went to the general store in town and spent a careful, minimal portion of the household money on paper and charcoal pencils, bringing them home in a brown paper parcel that she set on Lily's bed without ceremony or explanation. She didn't wait for thanks. She didn't make it into something that required a response. 2 days later, she came into the kitchen in the morning and found Lily sitting at the table, already drawing. The town of Blackstone Junction was a hard place with a practical soul. It had been built by and for the railroad, and the railroad remained its reason for existence. The trains that came through day and night carrying freight, cattle, mail, passengers, the repair yards, the supply depot, the network of small enterprises that existed to feed and clothe and provision the people who kept all of it running. The population was maybe 200 permanent residents, with a fluctuating population of rail workers passing through. There were 3 saloons and 1 church, a school that met 3 days a week, a general store, a doctor who was also a dentist and occasionally an amateur surveyor, and a woman named Dora Patton, who ran the boarding house and seemed to know everything about everyone at all times. Clara met Dora at the end of her first week at the general store. "You're the new Mrs. Mercer," Dora said. She was a compact woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and an expression that was sharp without being unkind. "Or soon to be." "Soon to be," Clara agreed. "Clara." She stopped. The hesitation was a quarter-second long at most. "Margaret Holloway, I'm pleased to meet you." She had been introduced as Margaret 4 times already that week. She was learning to answer to it without the delay. Dora studied her with the frank assessment of a woman who had been reading people for decades and had strong opinions about what she found. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone softer." Dora tilted her head slightly. "Wade's a good man, quiet. He doesn't always say what he needs, but he needed someone with some spine. I'm glad he got it." It was the strangest compliment Clara had ever received, and somehow the most welcome. The wedding took place 2 weeks after her arrival at the town's small registry office. There was no ceremony to speak of, a brief formal proceeding conducted by the Justice of the Peace, a handful of witnesses from the rail yard, Dora Patton, who appeared without being invited and was somehow exactly what the occasion needed. Clara signed the register. She wrote, "Margaret Holloway." The pen felt heavier than it should have. Afterward, Wade stood beside her on the registry office steps, and they looked out at the main street of Blackstone Junction. The dust, the wooden storefronts, the distant sound of a freight engine on the Eastern Line, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "I know this isn't how you imagined it," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the street. Marriage to a stranger. Out here. "I didn't come with many illusions," she said, which was true, just not in the way he meant it. He glanced at her sideways. "No, I don't think you did." There was something in his voice that she couldn't quite identify. Not suspicion, nothing that sharp. More like the beginning of recognition, the sense of looking at something familiar without yet knowing why. She looked away first. The days settled into a pattern. Clara learned the town's rhythms and the household's rhythms, and the particular rhythms of a man who worked with his hands and his mind in equal measure and came home tired in a way that went deeper than the body. She cooked meals that were better than the household had been eating. Not elaborate, but considered, the kind of food that required you to think about who was eating it. She kept the accounts. She began to recognize the rail workers who came by with questions or small emergencies and dealt with them with a directness that surprised some of them and seemed to please Wade, who watched her occasionally with that same expression she couldn't quite place. Lily remained careful, but the drawings multiplied. There were horses and trains and a series of figures that Clara suspected were studies of real people. One of them, she noticed, had dark hair and a worn coat and was carrying what appeared to be a suitcase. She didn't mention it. She set another package of drawing paper on the table and pretended she hadn't seen. The injuries came regularly. This was a railroad town, and the railroad was not kind to the men who worked it. A man named Ruiz came to the door one evening with 2 fingers bent wrong after a coupling accident. Clara straightened them herself because the doctor was at the other end of town, and the time it took to reach him would be worse than the temporary pain. She'd seen it done. She was not delicate about things that required not being delicate. Ruiz looked at her when it was done with an expression that was partly gratitude and partly reassessment. "Wade Mercer married well," he said. "He married practically," she said. "Which is not quite the same thing." Ruiz laughed. She hadn't meant it to be funny, but she was glad it landed that way. What she had not expected was the accumulating weight of the lie. In Chicago, in Helene's house, the deception had been theoretical. Something she was going to do, something she was preparing for, a problem she would solve when it presented itself. Once she arrived at Blackstone Junction, it became concrete and daily and relentless. Every time someone called her Margaret, every time she signed the name, every time Wade said it with the particular quality that a man's voice had when he was speaking to his wife, she felt the wrongness of it with fresh acuteness. She told herself that names were surfaces, that what mattered was the work, the care, the presence, that she was, in all the ways that counted, being true. But late at night, in the room she now shared with Wade, they were polite with each other, careful, the marriage still finding its shape in the way that arrangements between strangers did. She lay awake and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific weight of a thing that was not resolved. Wade slept on his side of the bed. He was quiet at night, which surprised her. She'd half expected him to be restless. He was still in sleep in the way of the very tired, barely moving, breathing slow and even. She watched the ceiling and thought about the letters Margaret had written, and the name on the registry, and the small girl in the next room who drew figures with dark coats and suitcases. "I will tell him," she thought, "when I know how. when I understand what comes after. But the days kept arriving, and she kept not finding the moment, and the longer she waited, the more the silence felt like a wall she was building one brick at a time. 6 weeks in, she and Lily found a language. It came through the horses. Lily had a particular attachment to the 2 horses that Wade kept in the small stable behind the house. Practical animals, both of them. Work horses rather than show animals, but Lily treated them with a devotion that seemed to go beyond the practical. Clara knew horses the way you knew something you'd grown up around. Her father had kept them before her mother's death, and the knowledge had stayed in her hands even when everything else changed. One afternoon, she found Lily in the stable trying to work a burr out of the bay mare's mane, going at it with fierce concentration and insufficient technique, the mare beginning to shift her weight in the way of an animal losing patience. "Let me," Clara said. Lily looked at her. "Hold her here." Clara took Lily's hand gently and placed it flat against the mare's neck. Not gripping, just steady, so she knows where you are. Lily held still. Clara worked the burr out with careful fingers, talking quietly to the mare the whole time. Not words that meant much, but sound that meant, "I am here, and I am not a threat." The mare settled. Lily watched. "How do you know to do that?" Lily said. It was the first full sentence she directed at Clara. "My father kept horses when I was small," Clara said. "I spent a lot of time in stables." "Your father's dead?" "Yes." "Mine's not dead," Lily said. She seemed to be considering something, but he was very sad for a long time, after my mother. "I know," Clara said. She kept her hands moving. "That kind of sad takes a while." "Is he still sad?" Clara thought about it. She didn't want to offer reassurance that was hollow. "He's less sad than he was," she said carefully. "I think that's the truth of it, but sad doesn't go away in a straight line." Lily considered this with the grave seriousness of a child who took information seriously. She didn't look convinced exactly, but she looked as though she was filing it. "He smiles more," she said. "Since you came?" Clara said nothing. She worked the last of the burr free and smoothed the mare's mane, and the horse exhaled softly and dipped her head. Wade came home that evening to find them both in the stable. Clara was teaching Lily how to properly clean a hoof, a procedure that required a certain firmness of manner and a willingness to ask a large animal to cooperate. And Lily was doing it with intense focus, her tongue slightly out, the way children held their mouths when they were concentrating. He stood in the stable doorway and watched them for a moment without announcing himself. Clara heard the creak of the door and glanced up. Their eyes met across the dim, hay-scented space. He had an expression she hadn't quite seen before. Something that wasn't the careful neutrality he mostly showed her, something less guarded, something that seemed to arrive before he could organize it. "Supper's not started," she said. "I lost track of time." "It's fine," he said. His voice was level, but there was something in it. "I'll start it." He went past them toward the house. Clara watched him go and then turned back to Lily, who was looking at the doorway her father had just vacated. "He never starts supper," Lily said. "Maybe he's learning," Clara said. Lily looked at her. Then she looked back at the hoof she was holding and went back to work. The thing about building something on a lie was that the building still happened. The thing became real, even if its foundation was wrong. Clara understood this in the abstract before she arrived in Blackstone Junction. She understood it differently, more specifically, by the end of those first 6 weeks. She was real here. The household was real. Lily's daily drawings, tacked up now along most of one wall of her room, real. The supper table with its conversation, halting at first and then gradually less so, about the rail yard and the weather and what Lily had learned at school, real. The night she sat up with Ruiz's wife, while Ruiz had a fever that broke just before dawn, and the way the woman pressed her hand and called her buena mujer, good woman, which Clara held on to later the way you held on to things that felt true when everything else was uncertain, all of it real. The name she was living under was wrong. Everything else was hers. She was starting to understand in a way she hadn't quite before that this was going to make it harder, not easier. That the longer the real things accumulated, the more catastrophic the eventual reckoning would be. She lay awake and thought, I need to tell him. She thought, I don't know how. She thought, if I tell him, I lose all of this. She thought, if I don't tell him, I lose it anyway. Only worse, only later, only at a point when Lily will also lose something she barely dared to begin to have. And then she heard the distant whistle of the overnight freight, that long, low sound moving through the dark beyond the window. And she thought about how many trains passed through this town, and how each one of them could carry anything, and how you never knew what was coming until it was already pulling into the station. She did not know, that night, what was coming. She was about to find out. The freight train that had kept Clara awake that night carried a new shift of track workers from the east. And by morning, they were already in the yard and Wade was already gone. And the day began the way most days began in Blackstone Junction, with noise and purpose and no particular interest in the interior lives of the people living alongside it. Clara made breakfast. Lily appeared at the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, hair loose from the braids, and stood for a moment in the particular half-asleep uncertainty of a child who had not yet committed to being awake. "Sit down," Clara said. "Eggs are almost done." Lily sat. She pulled her knees up to her chest in the chair, which was not how you were supposed to sit at a table, and which Clara did not remark on. Some things were not worth the expenditure. "Papa didn't say goodbye this morning," Lily said. "He was early. You were still sleeping." Clara slid the eggs onto a plate. "He left before 5. Something about the new crew needing to be shown the junction procedures." Lily accepted this without comment. She ate with the focused attention of someone who was actually hungry, and Clara watched her from the corner of her eye and thought, not for the first time, that this child had adapted to loss in ways that were both impressive and quietly troubling. She had learned to accommodate absence. She had learned not to require things that weren't reliably available. These were useful skills that cost something to develop, and the cost was not always visible from the outside. After breakfast, Lily went to get dressed for school. Clara cleared the plates and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the back of the property. The stable, the small kitchen garden that was producing adequately, if not generously, the fence line that separated their lot from the rail yard beyond. A freight locomotive was moving slowly along the eastern siding, its smoke rising into a sky that was already bright and cloudless. The sound of it came through the window glass as a low vibration, as much felt as heard. She had been here 7 weeks. 7 weeks of carrying another woman's name like a stone in her pocket, heavy and constant and impossible to set down. 7 weeks of building things that were real. 7 weeks of telling herself she would find the moment to confess, and not finding it, and watching the distance between herself and that moment grow. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel and went to get Lily's coat. The walk to school took 12 minutes at Lily's pace, which was not a rapid pace. Lily walked the way she did most things, with attention, stopping occasionally to examine something on the ground or remark on something she noticed. Today it was a hawk sitting on a fence post at the edge of the Greer property, watching the field below it, with the unhurried focus of a creature that understood patience as strategy. "It's hunting," Lily said. She had stopped completely. Her school bag was sliding off one shoulder. "Waiting to hunt," Clara said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Hunting is moving. What it's doing is deciding." Lily considered this. The hawk did not move. It sat on its post with absolute stillness and absolute attention, and then in one sudden compressed motion, it dropped from the fence into the grass and was up again almost immediately, something small in its talons, and gone. Lily watched the empty post for a moment. "How long does it wait?" she said. "As long as it needs to." Lily looked up at her. There was something in her face that was not quite a question and not quite a judgment, more like a careful assessment. She did this occasionally, looked at Clara as though she were a fence post herself, something to be examined with the same attention she gave the hawk, or the horses, or the drawings she made. "Were you patient before you came here?" Lily asked. Clara thought about it honestly. "I learned to be," she said. "It wasn't something I was born with. Papa says patience is something you practice." "Your father is right about that." Lily adjusted her bag and started walking again. The conversation ended as naturally as it had begun, dropped without ceremony, and they covered the remaining distance to the schoolhouse in silence that was not uncomfortable. At the door, Lily stopped and turned around. This was not her usual procedure. She typically went straight in without looking back. "Are you going to stay?" she said. The question was simple and not simple at all. "I intend to," Clara said. Lily looked at her for one more moment, then turned and went inside. Clara stood at the schoolhouse door for a few seconds after it closed. "I intend to." It was the most honest thing she could have said under the circumstances. It was also, she recognized, a kind of promise she had no right to make with any certainty, given the thing she was carrying. She walked back through town with that knowledge sitting square in the middle of her chest. Tick. Dora Patton was sweeping her front porch when Clara passed the boarding house, and the sweeping slowed in that particular way that meant conversation was being solicited. Clara stopped. She liked Dora in the way you liked someone who made no pretense about what they were doing. Dora read people and made judgments, and acted on those judgments, and did not see any reason to apologize for this system. "Early morning for you," Dora said. Walked Lily to school. Dora leaned on her broom. "She's talking to you yet?" "More than she was." "That's something." Dora studied her with that sharp, not unkind look. "You know she didn't speak for 3 months after her mother died. Not a word to anyone. Wade was nearly out of his mind with it." Clara had not known this. "What changed?" "She decided to, I suppose. The doctor said there was nothing physically wrong. She just stopped. And then she started again." Dora shrugged. "Children process things in ways that make no sense to adults and perfect sense to themselves." "How long ago did her mother die?" 3 years this past April. Fever. It came fast." Dora's expression shifted into something quieter. "Wade was on the line when it happened. He didn't make it back in time." She paused. "He doesn't talk about that. But it's there." Clara stood on the boardwalk and absorbed this. The particular shape of a grief she hadn't known the dimensions of before. Wade, coming home to a house that had changed irreversibly while he was 20 miles away on the line. Lily, 3 months of silence that must have felt to a father like watching something die twice. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara said. Dora started sweeping again. "Because you're going to be part of this family, and the parts of this family that aren't obvious are the ones that matter most." She swept a pile of dust off the edge of the porch. "And because you seem like the kind of woman who wants to understand things properly rather than just manage them." Clara thought about that for the rest of the walk home. Borges. The accounting had been neglected. This was the thing she discovered on a Tuesday afternoon when she found the household ledger tucked under a stack of rail schedules on the desk in the sitting room, Wade's desk, a functional piece of furniture covered in the organized clutter of a man who ran things, papers and schedules and letters that pertained to the job. She should not have been looking at the ledger. It was not something she'd been invited into. But the household money was something she'd been managing for 7 weeks, buying groceries and supplies and making do, and she had done this without really understanding what was available to be made do with. She picked up the ledger, told herself she was just getting a clearer picture, and sat down at the desk. The picture was clear enough, just not comfortable. Wade earned a foreman's wage from the railroad, which was decent. But the household expenses had been inconsistently managed for the better part of a year. Since well before she arrived, she could see, since before the advertisement for a wife had even been placed. There were months where the grocery costs were nearly double what they should have been. Not from extravagance, but from the inefficiency of a man managing domestic finances while simultaneously running a rail junction. Buying things as needed without a plan, paying slightly more than necessary for things he hadn't had time to price out properly. There were small, irregular debts, to the general store, to the farrier, that had been paid but only just, with the ragged timing of someone managing cash flow by feel rather than design. It was not a disaster, but it was not comfortable either, and it was heading in a direction that would become less comfortable without adjustment. She sat with the ledger for an hour, working through it with a pencil and a piece of paper, calculating what could be reduced, what should be different, what the realistic margin looked like if certain things were handled more carefully. Then she made herself a list and closed the ledger and put it back where she'd found it. She did not tell Wade what she'd done. Not that night. Not yet. She started implementing the adjustments quietly. The grocery order renegotiated with the general store, certain supplies purchased in quantity when she identified the right price, a small debt to the farrier settled in exchange for a standing arrangement that worked out better for both parties. She kept her own notes in a separate page folded into the back of the household diary. Wade noticed 2 weeks later that the month looked different in a way he couldn't quite account for. He brought it up at supper one evening, tentatively, as if he wasn't sure he was reading it right. The accounts, he said. I looked at them this morning. Lily was eating with focused efficiency. She had a way of seeming absent from certain conversations while actually absorbing everything. I've made some adjustments, Clara said. He looked at her. You went through the household ledger. I did. She held his gaze. I should have told you I was going to. I'm sorry I didn't. But the books hadn't been kept systematically, and it was causing some drift in the margins. I've corrected it. He was quiet for a moment. She couldn't read him. Whether he was bothered by the intrusion, or by the implication that his management had been lacking, or by something else altogether. How much drift? He said finally. She told him the number. It wasn't alarming, but it was real. He was quiet for a longer moment. I knew it was getting away from me, he said. I just didn't have the... He stopped. I didn't make time for it. You were managing other things. That's not an excuse. I didn't say it was. She paused. But it's a reason. Different thing. He looked at her with that expression she'd started to recognize, the one that came when something she said landed in a way he hadn't expected. Not surprise exactly, more like the recalibration of a man who kept expecting her to be something slightly simpler than she was, and kept finding she wasn't. Can you show me what you did? He said. Yes, she said. After Lily's in bed. Lily looked up briefly from her plate, registering this, and went back to eating. That evening, for the first time, they sat together at the desk in the sitting room, and Clara walked him through the adjustments she'd made and the system she'd put in place going forward. He asked questions. They were good questions, specific and practical, the questions of a man who was capable of understanding the system once it was explained, but who hadn't had the capacity to build it himself. She answered them without condescension and without the false modesty of someone pretending not to know things she knew. By the end of it, he had a clear picture, and she had, for the first time in the marriage, the feeling of having been genuinely useful to him in a way he'd been able to see directly. You've done this before, he said. Not a question. I kept my stepmother's household accounts for years, she said. The stepmother part was true, at least. She didn't trust them to anyone else, so she taught me to do it herself. She trusted you. Clara thought about Helene standing in the parlor with her hands folded, the train ticket on the table. In her way, she said. Wade let it rest there. He didn't probe, which was either courtesy or disinterest, and she couldn't always tell which it was with him. She had thought, coming here, that the hardest part would be the performance of being Margaret Holloway. The answering to the wrong name, the maintenance of the false history, the constant background vigilance required to not slip. The hardest part turned out to be something different. The hardest part was caring, not performing care, the real article. She had not expected to care about Lily's drawings, or Wade's careful management of his own exhaustion, or the way Ruiz's wife, Maria, brought her tamales one Sunday afternoon as a gesture of neighborhood solidarity. She had not expected to care about whether the town's small school had enough books, or whether the cook at the rail workers' mess was going to recover properly from the hand injury he'd sustained the previous week. She had not expected to care, and she did, and the caring made the lie worse. It was possible to deceive strangers. It was much harder to deceive people you had come to regard with something that was starting to feel like love, or at minimum like its more grounded, less dramatic cousin. Affection, investment, the sense that their well-being mattered in a personal way. She thought about this on a Friday evening when she was sitting on the front porch after supper, the day's heat beginning to release, the first freight of the night moving through the yard in the distance. Wade was inside reading something from work. Lily had gone to bed early after a day at school that had evidently been taxing in some unspecified way. She sat in the porch chair and looked at the street and thought, I need to tell him. Not eventually. Soon. The question that kept stopping her was not whether to tell him. She had resolved somewhere in the last 2 weeks that she was going to. The question was what happened after. He had married a woman named Margaret Holloway. The marriage was legal. She had signed the register and the register existed. But the woman who had signed it was not who she claimed to be, and whatever that meant in the eyes of the law in this territory, it was enough of a wrongness that she didn't know what solid ground looked like on the other side of it. He might send her away. He had every right to. She sat with that possibility and tried to look at it clearly. If he sent her away, she would be where she had started. No money, no connections, no place to go, with the additional weight of a broken arrangement and a child who had begun to trust her and would feel the loss of that trust as another abandonment. That was the consequence she could not make herself be at peace with. Not her own displacement, Lily's. It is not your job to protect Lily from the consequences of your own choices, she told herself. But she was not entirely persuaded by this argument. The door opened and Wade came out. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one without asking, which meant he had looked out and seen her sitting and made the assumption, and the assumption had been correct. "You've got your thinking face on," he said. He sat down in the other chair. "What does my thinking face look like?" "Like you're working through a problem that doesn't have a clean answer." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Accurate enough." He didn't ask what the problem was. This was one of his qualities she had come to appreciate. He created space without demanding it be filled. He drank his coffee and looked at the street. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." She thought about how to shape it. If someone had deceived you about something important and you found out later, after things had changed, after something real had been built on top of the deception, what would matter more to you, the lie or what came after it? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Depends on the lie," he said. "Assume it was significant." He turned the cup in his hands. Then it would matter whether the person had intended harm, and whether they'd kept lying after they had the chance to stop. He paused. A lie told out of fear with no intent to hurt anyone is different from a lie told to take advantage. Both are wrong, but they're not the same wrong. Clara said nothing. "Why are you asking?" His voice was even, careful, the voice of a man who is asking a genuine question and trying not to put pressure on the answer. "I'm thinking through something," she said. "I'll tell you when I've worked it out." He nodded, didn't push, drank his coffee. They sat on the porch while the night came in around them, and a second freight train moved through the yard with its deep rattle and its smoke, and a dog somewhere on the next street barked twice and then stopped. "Wade," she said. She had opened her mouth to say it, the whole of it, right there on the porch in the dark, the cups in their hands and the town going quiet around them. She had the words formed. She could hear them waiting in her throat. And then down the street, the unmistakable sound of running footsteps and Ruiz's voice cutting through the quiet, sharp and urgent in a way that meant the evening was not, in fact, going to proceed the way it had been. "Mercer." He was at the gate, breathing hard. "There's a man down at the junction. Coupling accident, bad one. They need you." Wade was already standing. He set his cup on the porch rail, looked at Clara once, briefly. "Go," she said. He went. Ruiz went with him. The gate swung shut and their footsteps faded down the street toward the rail yard, and Clara sat alone on the porch with her cooling coffee and the words she hadn't said, and the particular feeling of a moment that had passed and would not come back in exactly the same form. She went inside. She checked on Lily, who was sleeping, her drawings faintly visible in the moonlight coming through the thin curtains. She went to bed and lay awake listening for Wade's return, which came 3 hours later. Quiet footsteps, the careful sounds of a man trying not to disturb anyone. A brief pause outside the bedroom door. He came in, undressed in the dark with practiced efficiency. Lay down. "How bad?" she said. "He'll keep the hand, maybe most of it." A pause. "He's young, 22. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. After a while, Wade's breathing slowed into sleep. Clara lay beside him in the dark and thought about what she still hadn't said, and what she was going to do about it, and how long she had before the decision was made by circumstances rather than by her. The circumstances arrived on a Wednesday. She was in the general store going through the weekly grocery order with Amos Geller, who ran the store and had the personality of a man who had witnessed so much frontier commerce that almost nothing surprised him anymore, when the door opened behind her. She didn't look up immediately. She was checking something on her list. Amos's attention shifted to the new customer with the automatic alertness of a shopkeeper, and he said, "Be right with you, ma'am," in the tone he used for people he didn't recognize. Clara looked up. The woman who had come in was tall, with striking features and the kind of dark auburn hair that drew the eye. She was dressed in traveling clothes that were better quality than most of what came off the trains at Blackstone Junction, and she was looking around the store with the particular expression of someone assessing a place against a set of expectations it was failing to meet. She was also, unmistakably, Margaret Holloway. Clara went still. Margaret's eyes moved around the store with idle curiosity and landed on Clara, and for a fraction of a second they passed over her without recognition, because why would they? Clara looked different here. She was thinner and her hands were rougher, and she wore her hair differently, practically, because practical was what worked in a rail town. She was not the older sister Margaret had grown up occasionally noticing in the background of her own life. Then the recognition arrived. Clara watched it come. Margaret's expression didn't do anything dramatic. It settled, became careful. She was, whatever else could be said of her, not impulsive. "Margaret?" Amos said, because he'd heard the name used in reference to Clara often enough. He looked between the two of them with the confusion of a man watching something he didn't have context for. "There must be some mistake," Margaret said, pleasant and light, watching Clara. "I'm visiting a friend. Could you tell me where to find a Mr. Wade Mercer? He's a foreman with the railroad." Amos started to answer. Clara set down her grocery list. "The rail yard's on the east side of town," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. "But Mr. Mercer is generally home for supper by 6. I'd try the house then." Margaret looked at her. The pleasant expression held. "Thank you," she said. "You're very helpful." She bought a packet of crackers and left. Clara stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed. Amos was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just watched something he didn't understand. "Anything else on your list?" he said. "No," she said. "That's everything." She paid and left the store and stood on the boardwalk in the afternoon sun with her basket and her groceries and the specific sensation of a person who has been counting on more time than they actually have. The train she had been dreading had arrived. It was already pulling into the station, and she was standing on the platform with no plan, no script, and nowhere to hide. She straightened up, picked up her basket, began walking. If she had to face this, she was going to face it in her own house, on her own terms, before Margaret reached Wade first. Whatever happened next, she was not going to let the truth be delivered by someone else. She walked fast, but she did not run. Running would have attracted attention, and attention was the last thing she needed in the 12 minutes it took to get from the general store to the house. She kept her basket in one hand and her thoughts moving in the other direction, not toward the panic that was available to her if she chose it, but toward the practical shape of what needed to happen in the next several hours. Margaret was here. That fact was fixed and could not be altered. What was not yet fixed was the sequence of events that followed from it. Who spoke to whom, and when, and in what order, and what had already been decided before the words were said aloud. Sequence mattered. Clara had learned this from years of managing a household where the order in which things were handled determined almost entirely how they turned out. Wade came home at 6. It was now 4:30. She had approximately 90 minutes. She set her basket on the kitchen table and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the surface, breathing. Think. Margaret had bought crackers and asked for directions with the composure of a woman who had decided to play this slowly. She had not followed Clara out of the store. She had not made a scene. This meant she was calculating something, what advantage she held, how to use it, what she wanted out of the situation. Margaret had always been calculating in that way, not out of malice exactly, but out of a lifelong habit of assessing what was available to her and how to extract maximum benefit. It was something Helene had taught her, perhaps without intending to, by modeling it daily. What did Margaret want? That was the question. Clara started putting the groceries away because movement helped her think, and because the groceries needed to be put away regardless. She worked through it methodically. Margaret had not come here for sentiment. She had not made the long trip out to a frontier rail town to reconnect with a sister she had barely acknowledged. She had come because something had changed in her circumstances, or because Helene had sent her, or because the banker on the North Shore had not worked out the way everyone expected, or some combination of all three. Whatever the reason, she was here, and she was going to talk to Wade, either before Clara did or after, and the difference between those two scenarios was the difference between Clara having any control over this situation and having none at all. She finished with the groceries. She put a pot of water on for coffee because her hands needed something to do and because Wade would want coffee when he came home, and she might not have the time or the composure to make it later. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and did what she had been avoiding doing for 8 weeks. She thought clearly and without flinching about what she was going to say. Wade came home at 10 past 6. She heard him at the gate, the particular rhythm of his footsteps on the path, and she was at the stove when he came through the back door. Lily was at the table with her drawings. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the stew that had been going since mid-afternoon. "There's something I need to tell you," Clara said. She said it before he had fully come through the door, because if she let the ordinary evening establish itself, the coat on the hook, the questions about Lily's day, the sitting down, she would lose the nerve she had spent 90 minutes building. He stopped, read her face. He had gotten better at reading her face over the past weeks, or she had gotten worse at keeping it neutral. She wasn't sure which. "Lily," he said, without looking away from Clara, "can you go draw in your room for a bit?" Lily looked between them with the alertness of a child who understood when a room was being cleared. She gathered her papers and went without argument, which itself told Clara something about how clearly the tension was showing. The door to Lily's room closed. Wade set down the things he was carrying, a rolled sheaf of papers from the rail office, his hat, and looked at her. "Tell me," he said. She had rehearsed this. She had the sequence clear. She had planned to start with the circumstances, Helene, the parlor, the ticket, and work forward to the registry and the name, building toward the central fact rather than leading with it, so that he had enough context to understand the shape of it before the worst of it landed. She looked at him standing in the kitchen doorway, tired from a day's work, and she said what she had not planned to say first. "My name is Clara, not Margaret. I'm Margaret's half-sister. She was the one who answered your advertisement, but she accepted another offer before the train left, and my stepmother sent me in her place. You were not told. I am—" She stopped, started again. "I am sorry. I should have told you before the wedding. I should have told you that first day on the platform. I did not, and there is no explanation for that which makes it less of what it is." The kitchen was very quiet. The stew made a small sound on the back of the stove. Wade's face did not immediately do anything. He stood in the doorway, and she watched him absorb what she'd said with the specific stillness of a person who has heard something significant and is deciding whether they have understood it correctly. "Your name is Clara," he said. "Yes, Clara Holloway. I was using Margaret's name. I signed the registry that way." "You are not the woman I corresponded with." "No. I read the letters, I know what was in them, but they were not written by me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he moved into the kitchen fully, went to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He did not invite her to sit. He was not being rude, he simply needed to be at a different altitude for a moment. She understood this and remained standing. "Why didn't you say something that first day?" His voice was even. She could not tell if the evenness was control or simply shock. "Because I had nowhere to go back to," she said, "and because I was afraid." She paused. "Those are the true reasons. I am not going to dress them up." "Afraid of what?" "Of being sent back to a house where I was tolerated rather than wanted, of having no options at all." She held his gaze. "Of you, of what you would decide. I didn't know you yet." "You don't know me now." "I know you better than I did." He looked down at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, the way hers had been earlier, and she wondered if he was doing the same thing she had been, using the solidity of something real to keep his thoughts orderly. "Is there something else?" he said. "Anything else I haven't been told?" "No." She said it without hesitation. "Everything else has been true." He was quiet for a while, long enough that she began to hear all the sounds the kitchen made when it was not being attended to. The stew, the slight creak of the house settling, a bird outside the window. "There's something else you need to know," she said. "There's a woman in town. She arrived today. She is—" The difficulty of the next part was different in kind from the confession she'd just made. "She is Margaret, my sister. She came here." Wade looked up. "Your sister is in Blackstone Junction. She was at the general store this afternoon. She asked for directions to find you." Clara watched his face. "I don't know what she wants, but she's here, and she knows I'm here, and whatever she intends, I thought you should hear what I've told you before you heard anything from her." He stood up, slowly, like a man whose body was heavier than it had been when he sat down. He went to the window and looked out at the back of the property, the stable, the fence line. "Go check on Lily. he said. Wade, please. Not harsh, but final. I need a few minutes. Check on Lily. She went. Okay. Lily was sitting on her bed with her drawings arranged around her in a deliberate pattern, which was what she did when she was anxious. Ordered the things she could control. She looked up when Clara came in. Is something wrong? Lily said. Your father and I were talking about something complicated, Clara said. She sat down on the edge of the bed, carefully among the drawings. Nothing that needs to worry you tonight. You were talking about something bad. We were talking about something true, Clara said. Those aren't always the same thing. Lily considered this. She picked up one of her drawings, the one of the figure with the dark coat and the suitcase, which she had added to significantly since the first version. The figure was now in a house, or the suggestion of one. There were smaller figures around it. Is it about who you are? Lily said. Clara went very still. Lily did not look up from her drawing. I heard you tell Papa your name was different, she said. The wall is thin. Clara breathed in slowly, out slowly. Yes, she said. It's about that. You're not Margaret. No, my name is Clara. I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you from the beginning. Lily was quiet for a moment, tracing the edge of her drawing with one finger. My teacher at school is called Mrs. Hartley, but I found out her real name is something different. She changed it when she got married and then changed it back when her husband died, and she said she didn't know what name felt right anymore. Clara looked at her. What did you say to her? I said she could be both. Names are just what people call you. They don't change what you are. The simplicity of it was almost painful. Clara sat with it for a moment. You're very wise for 8, she said. I'm 9, Lily said. She still didn't look up. Since last month. Clara had missed her birthday. The realization landed with a specific weight. She had been in this house for Lily's birthday and had not known it was her birthday because there had been no celebration, no mention, nothing. The day had passed like any other day. I didn't know, she said. I'm sorry. Lily shrugged, the gesture of a child who had taught herself not to be disappointed about certain things. Papa forgot too. He remembered 2 days later. He felt bad. What did you want for your birthday? Lily was quiet for a moment. I wanted things to stop changing, she said. Then, with the self-awareness that occasionally broke through her composure and reminded Clara she was also just a child. But that's not a thing you can give someone. No, Clara said. It's not. She sat with Lily for another few minutes, not speaking, and then she heard Wade's voice from the other side of the house, not raised, but present in a way that meant someone was at the door. Stay here, Clara said, and went. Margaret was on the front porch. She was not alone. She had arrived with a man Clara did not recognize, well-dressed, with the look of a person who had come some distance at some expense and was not particularly pleased about the conditions he'd arrived in. He had the air of a lawyer or an official of some kind, precise and watchful. Wade was in the doorway. He had not let them in. Clara came to stand beside him. She was aware of Margaret's eyes moving from her face to Wade's and back, reading the situation with quick accuracy. Clara, Margaret said. Her tone was something between cordial and careful, the tone of a woman maintaining her position while she assessed the terrain. You look different. Margaret, Clara said, you should have written. I wasn't sure a letter would be welcome. Margaret's gaze moved to Wade. Mr. Mercer, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I'm Margaret Holloway, the woman who corresponded with you. Wade said nothing immediately. Clara could feel him beside her, his stillness, the quality of attention he brought to things when he was deciding how to respond. I'm aware of who you are, he said. Something shifted slightly in Margaret's expression. She had expected more disruption than this, Clara thought. She had expected to arrive and find a situation she could leverage, a husband who didn't yet know the truth, a sister caught in an exposed lie, a chaos she could shape to her advantage. She had not expected the ground to be already different. Then you know why I'm here, Margaret said. Why don't you tell me, Wade said. In plain terms. Margaret paused. The man beside her, the lawyer or whatever he was, remained silent, watching. I came to clarify the legal situation, Margaret said. The marriage was contracted in my name. I have documents establishing who I am and who I am not. It seems to me there are questions about the validity of "you can stop there," Wade said. His voice had not changed in volume or tone, but there was something in it that had not been there before. A flatness, a finality, the voice of a man who had spent the last 20 minutes deciding something and had arrived at his decision. Any questions about the validity of anything in this household will be handled by me, in my own time, through the appropriate channels, he said, not on my porch at 7 in the evening with the man I've never met. Mr. Mercer, the legal... You're welcome to sleep at the boarding house on the east side of town. Mrs. Patton runs it. She's fair. If there are formal matters to discuss, I'm at the rail office most mornings before 8. He looked at her for a moment. I'll say good evening to you both. He stepped back from the door. Not slamming it. There was no drama in the gesture. He simply closed it. The porch was on the other side. The house was on this side. Clara stood in the entry and looked at the closed door and felt something she could not immediately name. I'm sorry, she said, about all of it. About Margaret being here. I don't know why she came. I think I have a sense of why she came, Wade said. His voice was tired. He moved past her toward the kitchen. She came because she thought there was something here she could claim. Clara followed. There might be. Legally, I mean. I don't know what the law says about... I know what the law says. He stopped at the kitchen counter. I've been a widower dealing with property and legal documents for 3 years. I know what a lawyer's visit means and what it doesn't. He turned around. She can't void this marriage without my cooperation. A false name in the registry is grounds for annulment if I pursue it. If I don't, it's a different matter. Clara absorbed this. You spoke to someone. I have a friend who reads law. I went to him after you told me. He looked at her. That's what I did with the few minutes you gave me. She had not expected this, that in the time she was sitting with Lily, he had been making a practical assessment. She should have expected it. It was entirely consistent with who he was. But she had been preparing herself for a different kind of evening. Wade, she said, I don't want you to make any decision based on Margaret being here. Whatever you decide about this, about us, it should be decided because it's what you actually want, not to keep her from having something. He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. Is that what you think is happening? I don't know what's happening. You found out an hour ago that your wife isn't who she said she was. You have every right to... To what? He crossed his arms. Not defensive exactly, more like a man bracing himself against something. To throw you out? To... He stopped, started again. I have been thinking for the last hour about what you said. Not about the name, about fear, about nowhere to go. He looked at the table, at the kitchen, at the pot on the stove that was still going. You've been here 9 weeks. You have kept this household together in ways I didn't manage to do for a year. You have been good to my daughter. He paused. You kept the accounts. Not. It was such a specific thing to say, in such a specific tone, that it almost made her want to laugh, or cry, or both. I kept the accounts, she said. I'm saying... He stopped again. He was not a man who spoke easily about certain things. She had learned this. He processed internally and emerged with conclusions rather than showing the working. I'm saying that I understand why you didn't tell me. I don't think it was right, but I understand it. And I don't think what you are now is defined by how you got here. Clara stood in the kitchen and looked at him and felt the particular vertigo of a situation changing faster than she could track it. You haven't had enough time to be angry yet, she said. I'm plenty angry, he said. I'm also tired and hungry, and there are things here that need to be sorted out carefully, and I cannot afford to sort them out badly. He moved to the table and sat down. Is supper ready? She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and checked the stew. Nearly, she said. All right. He put his elbows on the table and rubbed his face briefly with both hands, the gesture of a man allowing himself one moment of visible exhaustion before pulling himself back together. Call Lily. Supper was not comfortable exactly, but it was real. Lily came out and ate with the careful quietness of a child monitoring the atmosphere of a room, alert to every exchange. Wade asked her what she had done at school with the particularity that always characterized those questions, and Lily answered with more words than usual, which Clara suspected was Lily's way of filling space she understood needed filling. Clara ate and said little. She was acutely aware of everything, the weight of the day, the fact that Margaret was somewhere in this town at this moment, the things that had been said, and the things that were still unresolved, and the things that might never resolve cleanly. After supper, while Lily helped clear the table, a new habit she had adopted 2 weeks ago without being asked, Clara went to the window and looked out at the street. Evening, full dark now, the lamps along the main road making soft pools of light, the distant yard noise of the railroad carrying on as it always did. She heard Wade come to stand behind her. Not close, there was still distance between them, appropriate under the circumstances. "She'll go to the Justice of the Peace tomorrow," Clara said. "Margaret, she'll try to make it official." "Probably." "What will you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'll go see Judge Calloway in the morning. He's 2 towns east, but he's a fair man. I'd rather have this handled properly than quickly. And in the meantime? In the meantime, nothing changes in this house." His voice was flat, but not cold. "Whatever gets sorted legally will get sorted, but I'm not doing it in a panic, and I'm not doing it on Margaret Holloway's schedule." Clara turned around. He was closer than she'd thought, and she was suddenly aware of the kitchen around them, the ordinary, worn, specific kitchen of the house they shared, the house that had been nothing but clean and spare when she arrived, and was now something incrementally more. "I need to ask you something honestly," she said. "Go ahead." "If Margaret hadn't come, if you'd found out some other way, a letter, or I told you myself, would you be standing here the same way?" He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than answering immediately. "I'd be angrier," he said. "The way she arrived, with a lawyer on my porch, that changed the shape of things, made it simpler in some ways, easier to know where I stood." He looked at her. "But no, I don't think I'd be sending you away. Because of Lily. Because of several things," he said. "Lily is one of them." She didn't ask what the others were. Some things needed to find their own time. But Dora Patton arrived the next morning before 8, which meant Margaret had made an impression at the boarding house. Clara opened the door, and Dora came in with the expression of a woman who had news she considered herself obligated to deliver in person. "Your sister's telling a version of things," Dora said. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, which was her standard practice. Not a dishonest version exactly, but a version. Clara set a cup of coffee in front of her. "What version?" "That she was deceived. That the arrangement was contracted in her name and that she was misled about the situation. That she came here to correct a wrong done to her." Dora wrapped her hands around the cup. "She's a persuasive woman. She's had practice. Several of the men at the rail yard were listening to her at breakfast. Ruiz's wife came to tell me. She thought you should know." Dora looked at her steadily. "She's not making accusations about you specifically. She's playing the injured party. It's a smarter strategy." Clara stood at the counter and thought about this. If she's the injured party, Wade is the one who owes her redress, and redress might mean the marriage isn't valid. "That's the direction it points," Dora agreed. "Whether it gets there depends on the judge." "Wade's going to see Judge Calloway today." Dora nodded. "Good. Calloway's not a fool. He'll want to know the full story before he rules on anything." She paused. "What is the full story? I know what I've pieced together, but I'd rather hear it from you," Clara told her. "All of it. The parlor, Helene, the ticket, the name on the registry, the 9 weeks." She told it plainly, without the softening she might have been tempted to apply, because Dora was not a woman who benefited from softening and because Clara was tired of managing what people knew and didn't know about her. When she finished, Dora was quiet for a moment. "You should have told him sooner," she said. "I know. That's not a criticism. It's a fact. He deserved to know sooner." Dora drank her coffee. "But I've known Wade Mercer for 3 years, and I know what his life looked like before you arrived. And whatever name you came here with, what you've done in this house since you got here is real." She set the cup down. "The question is whether the town sees that. Because Margaret's in the boarding house telling her story to anyone who'll listen, and stories move fast in a place this size." Clara thought about the rail workers who had listened to Margaret at breakfast. She thought about Ruiz and Maria, who had been kind to her. She thought about Amos Geller at the general store, who knew her weekly order and always had her tobacco order ready on Fridays for the railwives' delivery. She thought about the school teacher who nodded at her when she dropped Lily off and who had, 2 weeks ago, quietly told her that Lily was doing better this term than she had in the past year. "What do you think I should do?" she said. Dora looked at her with that sharp, measured gaze. "I think you should go about your day the way you always do," she said. "I think you should let Wade handle what's legal and let the town see who you are by watching what you do. And I think you should stop being afraid of the truth." She paused. "You've been carrying it like it's going to destroy everything. Maybe it changes things. Probably it changes some things. But you've been building something real here, Clara. That doesn't disappear because someone arrived on a train with a lawyer." Clara looked at her. "You used my name," she said. "It's your name," Dora said. "Someone ought to use it." Margaret came to the house at noon. Clara had been expecting it and was in the garden when she heard the gate. She straightened up and turned around, and there was her sister, alone this time, without the lawyer, standing at the garden gate in her better clothes, with an expression that was harder to read than yesterday. "I thought we should talk," Margaret said, "without the men around." "Come in, then," Clara said. She opened the gate. They sat on the porch. Clara did not offer coffee. There were limits to hospitality. Margaret looked at the house, the garden, the stable visible at the back. Her expression was something between appraising and something else Clara couldn't quite name. "Mother said you'd manage," Margaret said finally. "Out here. She said you were the practical one. She said that while she was sending me to impersonate you. She said it before that. As a compliment, I think, in her way." Margaret looked at her hands. "I didn't know about the lawyer until I arrived. He's Helene's man. She arranged it." Clara went very still. "Helene sent you." "She sent him. I came because—" Margaret stopped. Started again. "The banker. The North Shore family." She pressed her lips together briefly. It didn't proceed the way everyone expected. "I'm sorry," Clara said. She meant it, partially. "It doesn't matter now." Margaret looked up. "I'm not here to take anything from you. I want you to know that. What Helene wants and what I want are not the same thing." "Then what do you want?" Margaret looked at her directly. "I want to understand how it is that you managed to build this." She gestured. The house, the garden, all of it. "In 9 weeks. I want to understand how you did that." Clara looked at her sister. Really looked at her. The traveling clothes that were too good for this town, the careful composure that cost something to maintain, the dark auburn hair that Helene had always praised, and Clara's plain dark hair she had never commented on. "I didn't do anything clever," Clara said. "I showed up and worked. I paid attention to what was needed, and I tried to meet it. That's all." "That's not nothing." "No, but it's not a secret." Margaret was quiet. A train moved through the yard in the distance, that familiar low vibration coming through the air. "The lawyer is going to push the case regardless of what I say," Margaret said. "Helene has instructed him. I don't have authority to stop him." "I know," Clara said. "I'm telling you so you can prepare." Clara looked at her. "Why?" Margaret looked back at her with an expression that was, underneath all the careful composure, genuinely tired. "Because Helene treated you badly for 15 years and treated me not much better, and I have spent a long time telling myself it was simply how things were." She looked away. "It's not, though. It isn't. It was wrong. And you're my sister, and this is the least I can do." The porch was quiet. The bird in the garden made a sound. The wind moved through the window box plants, which Clara had watered and straightened and which were now actually growing. "Tell me what the lawyer intends," Clara said, and Margaret told her. What Margaret told her was this. Helene's lawyer, a man named Pratt, from a firm in Chicago that handled contested estates and domestic disputes, intended to file a formal petition with the territorial court, arguing that the marriage between Wade Mercer and Margaret Holloway had been entered into under fraudulent misrepresentation. The petition would name Clara specifically as the party who had committed the fraud. It would argue that the marriage was therefore void, that Wade was legally unattached, and that Margaret, as the original contracting party, had standing to seek remedy. which in Helene's interpretation meant that whatever had been promised in the original correspondence was still owed. What does she actually want? Clara said. Helene, not a legal principle. What does she want out of this? Margaret looked uncomfortable. Money, she said. She believes that if the marriage is voided and Wade chooses to proceed with a legitimate arrangement, there would be a settlement. Or if he doesn't choose to proceed, that the fraud claim could be leveraged into a payment. She paused. She views it as a business matter. Of course she does. Clara, I'm not angry with you, Clara said, and was surprised to find this was mostly true. I'm angry with the situation. It's different. Margaret left an hour later, and the porch felt smaller after she was gone, the way a space sometimes contracted when something large had been removed from it. Clara sat for a few more minutes looking at the garden and working through what she'd learned. Pratt would file within the week, Margaret had said. He had already taken a room in town, not at Dora's, at the smaller place on the western edge. He was being methodical about it, establishing local presence before the petition, making himself visible to the justice of the peace and anyone else with official standing in Blackstone Junction. The strategy was clear enough. Create a public record of the fraud, build local pressure, and give Wade a choice. Pursue a legitimate arrangement with the original contracting party, which Helene imagined would involve some financial transfer she could extract, or face an ongoing legal disruption to his household and his standing in a town where his reputation was his primary professional asset. It was, Clara had to admit, not a stupid strategy. A railroad foreman's position depended on the trust of the company and the cooperation of the community. A sustained legal cloud over his household was the last thing he could afford. She went inside and started a list. Wade came home in the late afternoon rather than the evening, which told her his day had not gone the way he'd planned. He came through the back door and looked at her at the table with her papers and said, Judge Calloway is unavailable until next Thursday. He's handling a land dispute 3 counties east. I know about Pratt, Clara said. Margaret told me this afternoon. Sit down. He sat. She told him what Margaret had described, the petition, the strategy, Helene's objective. She was concise about it because he was the kind of man who processed better without excess around the essential facts. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She wants money. Yes. From me. Through the legal mechanism of voiding the marriage and then negotiating a settlement for the disruption to the original arrangement. Clara looked at him. It's the kind of move that works if the person on the other end doesn't want to fight. They'd rather pay and be done. I'd rather not pay and be done, Wade said. I know, she paused. But I want to be honest with you about what fighting it costs. Pratt files the petition, it becomes a matter of public record in this territory. Your name, the marriage, the fraud. It's all attached to a court document. The railroad company will hear about it. Your supervisor will have questions. He looked at the table. Patterson. That was his supervisor, she knew. A man named Cal Patterson who ran the Western Division from an office 2 towns north. If Patterson hears about it before you speak to him, that's one version of events he gets, Clara said. If you speak to him first, you control the version. Wade looked at her. When did you start thinking like this? I always thought like this, she said. I just didn't have anything worth protecting before. He was quiet for a moment. There was something in his face that she was still learning to read. Not quite the expression from before, the careful, neutral assessment. Something more direct than that, more present. What else? He said. Margaret, she said. She told me Helene sent Pratt, not her. She said she doesn't have authority to stop him. But she also said, Clara chose the next words carefully. She said she was on our side. I believe her mostly, but I also think that what she can actually do is limited, and I wouldn't build a strategy around her cooperation. What strategy would you build? Clara looked down at her list. 3 things. First, you speak to Patterson before Pratt has the chance. You tell him the situation plainly, on your own terms. Second, we speak to people in town, not pleading our case, not making speeches, just making sure that the people who know us know what's actually happening before the rumor version fills in the gaps. Third, we find someone who reads law in this territory and is not connected to Helene, and we understand exactly what standing Pratt's petition actually has, because Margaret's version of Helene's legal theory and the actual law may not be the same thing. Wade looked at her list, then at her. You wrote all this while I was gone, he said. I had time. He was quiet for another moment. Outside, the first evening freight was moving through the yard. That long, low sound that had become so woven into the texture of her daily life that she barely noticed it anymore except at moments like this, when the rest of the world was very quiet. Clara, he said. It was the first time he had used her name, not Margaret, her name. It landed differently than she had expected, more weight and less ceremony somehow. I want to ask you something. All right? If we get through this, if Pratt files and we handle it and the legal matter settles one way or another, what do you want? Not what you think I want. What do you want? She looked at him. It was a question she had not been asked in a very long time. Possibly not ever, not in the direct way he meant it. Her wants had always been managed around other people's requirements, shaped to fit the available space rather than declared outright. I want to stay, she said. I want to keep what we've been building here. I want Lily to know she's not going to lose anyone else. She paused. I want my own name on things. That last part I can make happen, he said. The rest, yes. That's what I want too. It was not a romantic declaration. It was two people at a kitchen table with a legal problem and a household and a child asleep in the next room, agreeing on something essential. Clara had read enough of the letters Margaret had written to know that Wade Mercer was not a man who communicated in romantic declarations. He communicated in actions and in specific, honest statements that meant exactly what they said. She decided this was better. Wade rode north to see Patterson the following morning, leaving before light. Clara watched him go from the kitchen window and then turn back to the day's work, with the particular focus of a person who has no productive use for worry and knows it. She took Lily to school. On the way back through town, she stopped at the general store. Amos Geller was stacking cans on the far shelf and looked up when she came in. His expression was careful in the way it had been since Margaret's visit, the expression of a man who had heard things and was waiting to understand what they meant. Morning, Amos, she said. She used her normal voice, her normal manner. I need to talk to you about something. He came down from the step stool. All right. She told him. Not everything. The full accounting was Wade's to give or not give as he chose, but the essential shape of it. That she had come here under her sister's name, that the situation was now being contested, that she was not going anywhere, and that whatever Pratt was circulating around town was one version of events and not the complete one. Amos listened with the stillness of a man who had been in business in a frontier town long enough to have heard almost everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You kept the household account current, he said. Yes, better than it was before. Wade was running 2 weeks behind on the credit line when you arrived. You cleared it and kept it clear. He scratched the back of his neck. I don't have a strong interest in what names people use. I have an interest in whether I can rely on people. You can rely on me, she said. I know that already, he said. That's why I'm telling you instead of keeping quiet about it. She left the store 10 minutes later, having also learned what Pratt had been saying to people and who had been listening. The lawyer had been efficient. He had spoken to the justice of the peace, to two of the older rail workers who tended to carry information through the yard, and to the woman who ran the laundry and who had opinions about everything and shared them freely. He had framed the matter as a legal irregularity requiring correction, not as a personal attack, which was clever because it kept him out of the territory of gossip while still doing the work of gossip. Clara went next to see Maria Ruiz. Maria's house was 3 streets over, a small place with a well-kept yard and a kitchen that always smelled of something good. Maria came to the door and looked at Clara and said, "Come in," without preamble, which told Clara that Dora had already been here, or that Maria had a sharp enough sense of the situation to know what the visit was about. It was Dora. She had come the previous evening, Maria said, and had explained the broad outlines. Maria's husband had heard about Pratt from the yard and had come home unhappy about it. He likes you, Maria said. She was rolling dough at the table and did not stop while they talked. Ruiz, he doesn't always say these things, but I know. You fixed his fingers and you didn't make a drama of it. That matters to him. I'm glad, Clara said. I came to tell you myself rather than let the secondhand version be all there was. Maria glanced up. What is the secondhand version? That a woman came here with a false name to deceive a man, and now her family is claiming the deceived man is owed something. Maria made a sound that was not quite a word. The version I would tell, Clara said, is that a woman was sent somewhere with a false name because she had no other option, and she has spent 9 weeks trying to make something real out of it, and a lawyer showed up to use the false name as a tool to extract money. Which version is true? Parts of both, Clara said. The false name is true. The 9 weeks are true. The extracting money part is what the lawyer wants. Maria rolled the dough for a moment in silence. Ruiz will talk to the men at the yard, she said. Not an offer, a statement of what was going to happen. He already wants to. I told him to wait and hear what you said first. Tell him the truth, Clara said. All of it. I'm not asking anyone to take my side on the basis of incomplete information. Maria looked at her steadily. You're a strange woman, she said. So I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. Maria turned back to her dough. My mother used to say the people worth knowing were the ones who didn't need you to believe something specific about them. They just needed you to see them clearly. Clara stood in Maria's kitchen and felt the particular complicated weight of being seen clearly. All of it visible, the deception and the 9 weeks and the things she was still trying to build. It was not comfortable. It was not the same as being forgiven or approved of. But it was honest, and she had been living without honesty for long enough that the absence had its own particular exhaustion. Thank you, she said. Come for supper Saturday, Maria said. Bring Lily. Ruiz will be there, and you can answer his questions directly. He prefers that. Pratt filed the petition on Friday. Clara knew before Wade did, because Dora saw the justice of the peace accepting the papers and sent word to the house. She had the document, or a description of it, from Dora before noon. It was precisely what Margaret had described, a formal assertion of fraudulent misrepresentation in the marriage contract, requesting a finding of invalidity and a hearing to determine remedy. Wade came home at lunch, which he did not normally do. He had gotten word at the rail office. He came through the back door and set his hat on the counter and stood for a moment with his back to her. Pratt filed, he said. I know. Dora sent word this morning. He turned around. He had the look of a man who had been managing anger for several hours through the blunt instrument of work and was running low on that particular resource. How did Patterson take it? She said. He was... Wade paused. He was careful. He didn't say anything that committed him, but I could see him thinking about how it looked. He sat down. The company doesn't want complications. They want the junction running and the freight moving. A foreman with a contested marriage and a fraud petition is a complication. Did he say that? He said he was sure it would be resolved satisfactorily and that he had every confidence in my judgment. Wade's voice was flat. Which means he's watching. Clara sat down across from him. All right. What do we need for the hearing? Evidence that the marriage is valid and should be maintained, or that the fraud, while real, doesn't constitute grounds for nullification under territorial law. He looked at her. I found someone who reads law. His name is Hector Bell. He's in Milford, 1 town south. He says the petition has problems. What kind of problems? Pratt filed on behalf of Margaret as the aggrieved party, but Margaret would need to testify to her injury. What was she deprived of? She accepted another arrangement before you left Chicago. She wasn't deceived. She was replaced. He rubbed his jaw. Bell says if Margaret testifies honestly, Pratt's case falls apart. And if she doesn't testify honestly, then it's harder. He looked at the table. Bell can argue the marriage should stand on other grounds, that I had full knowledge of the relevant facts before choosing to maintain it, which means any fraud was effectively remedied by informed consent. But that argument requires me to have known about it for some time before the petition, which means I need to explain why I didn't immediately seek an annulment myself when I found out. Because you didn't want to, Clara said. Because I didn't want to, he confirmed, which is true, but it's a complicated truth to put in front of a judge. They sat with this for a moment. Margaret said she was on our side, Clara said. She said she didn't want to take anything from us. Can you reach her? I think so. She's still at Dora's. He looked at her. Would you be willing to ask her to testify honestly? Yes, Clara said, but I want to do it without making it a demand. If she testifies because she's afraid or pressured, it won't hold up the same way. Agreed. He stood up. I have to go back to the yard. I've got a crew from the Eastern Division coming in at 2, and I can't leave Ruiz to handle it alone. He picked up his hat, stopped. You talk to people in town? Yes. Amos said something to me yesterday, and one of the older yardmen, Callahan, said something this morning. They were... He paused, choosing the word. Measured. Not angry at me, not looking at me like I was a fool. He looked at her. What did you say to them? The truth, she said, the whole truth. Both parts of it. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had been learning, the one that arrived before he had organized it, the one that came when something she did exceeded what he'd expected. All right, he said. He put his hat on. I'll be back by 6. He went. She sat for another minute at the table, and then she got up and put on her coat and went to find Margaret. Margaret was in Dora's sitting room, which Dora used as a common space for guests who had nowhere else to be. She was sitting by the window with a book she was not reading, and she looked up when Clara came in with the alert caution of someone who had been expecting a confrontation and was braced for it. I'm not here to fight, Clara said. She sat down across from her. I'm here to ask you something. Ask? Pratt filed. You know that. He told me this morning. Bell, the lawyer Wade found, says the case has a significant weakness. If you testify honestly about your own situation, about the fact that you accepted another arrangement before I left Chicago, the claim of injury doesn't hold up. You weren't deprived of something you were counting on. Margaret set the book down. You want me to testify against Helene's case. I want you to tell the truth. What you do with that is your choice. Clara looked at her directly. But you told me you were on our side. I'm here to find out if that was true. Margaret looked out the window. The street outside was ordinary. A wagon passing, a woman with a basket crossing to the other side, 2 children who had escaped from somewhere chasing each other along the boardwalk. If I testify, Margaret said, Helene will know. Yes. She'll... Margaret stopped. Clara could see the calculation working across her face, the assessment of consequences, the weighing of what was owed against what it cost. This was the thing about Margaret that had always been true. She was not without conscience. She simply had to find the version of events in which conscience and self-interest pointed the same direction. She won't have anything to hold over you, Clara said. If the case is dismissed, there's nothing for her to leverage. You'd be done with it. She paused. You said the banker didn't work out. You said you came back to Chicago with nothing to show for it. Helene has been managing that, I imagine, deciding what the next move is. If you testify and the case closes and there's no more money to be extracted from it, you're free of that particular situation. Margaret looked at her. That's a very practical way to frame it. I learned from the best, Clara said. Or the worst. I'm not always sure there's a difference. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, the composure cracking slightly, not in a dramatic way, but in the way of a person who is tired of holding a particular shape. You don't know what it's like, Margaret said. Being Helene's daughter, you were the spare, the one she didn't have to work with directly. I was the one she was always managing, the one whose choices she directed, the one she... She stopped. It doesn't matter. It matters, Clara said. I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm saying the way out of that is different from the way she's pointing you. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the children ran back the other direction. The wagon was gone. What happens to me after, she said. If I testify, if the case is dismissed, what do I do then? It was a genuine question, asked without pretense, and Clara felt the particular sting of it, how similar it was to the question she'd been asking herself, sitting in Helene's parlor with a train ticket, before any of this had started. I don't know, she said honestly, but you'd be making the choice yourself. That's different from being managed into something. Margaret looked at her for a long time. You actually believe that? Yes. You came out here with nothing, and you built something. You think everyone can do that. I don't think everyone has the same circumstances, Clara said. I think you're in a worse position than me in some ways. I think you have more to lose from Helene's anger because she's directed more of it at you. I'm not pretending that's simple. She paused. But I also think you're sitting in that chair because some part of you already decided. You came and told me about Pratt. You didn't have to do that. Margaret picked up the book again, which was not necessarily the gesture it appeared to be. She was thinking. Clara had seen this before, Margaret using the appearance of casual activity to cover the process of making up her mind. "The hearing is when?" Margaret said. "Belle is working on the date. Probably 2 weeks. I'll need to know what questions Belle intends to ask me." Clara went still. "Does that mean—" "It means I'll need to know what questions he intends to ask me," Margaret said. Her voice was level, careful, giving nothing away yet. "Before I commit to anything, I'll speak to your lawyer, then I'll decide." It was not a yes, but it was the most specific thing it could be without being a yes, and Clara was experienced enough at managing uncertain situations to know that this was the best available outcome of this conversation right now. "I'll tell Wade to have Belle contact you," she said. "Fine." Margaret looked out the window again. Then, without looking back, "Your window boxes, the ones at the front of the house. You fixed them. The plants were dying. They looked better when I walked past this morning. That's all I was saying." Clara stood up. "Come to supper Saturday," she said. "At the house. Maria Ruiz will be there, Dora, probably, Wade." Margaret looked at her. "You're inviting me to your house." "You're my sister," Clara said. "Whatever else is true." She left before Margaret could answer, because sometimes the best thing you could do with an opening was leave it open. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the strangest of Clara's time in Blackstone Junction. The town had sorted itself in the way that small towns did. Not cleanly, not without disagreement, but into a shape. The rail workers, by and large, had landed on the side of Wade and Clara, and since the rail workers were the largest single group in the town's population, their weight mattered. Ruiz had spoken at the yard, as Maria had predicted, and he had spoken plainly and without embellishment, and the men who respected him had listened. There were still people who were uncomfortable with the situation. The justice of the peace had a rigid streak about legal propriety that worked in Pratt's favor. And there was Callahan's wife, who had listened to Pratt and had opinions she shared daily. But the texture of Clara's daily life was mostly unchanged, and this felt important. She walked Lily to school. She kept the accounts. She cooked and mended and managed the household with the same attention she'd been paying for 9 weeks. She went to the store and spoke to Amos and to the women she'd come to know. She did not behave like a person waiting to be expelled because she had decided not to wait. Lily knew the hearing was coming. She did not speak about it directly, but the drawings on her wall had changed. There were fewer horses and more figures, and the figures were arranged in groupings that seemed deliberate, clusters of shapes that Clara thought might be her attempt to draw what she wanted rather than what she saw. On the Thursday before the hearing, Lily left a drawing on Clara's side of the kitchen table. It was 2 figures, one taller and one smaller, standing side by side. The taller one had dark hair, the smaller one had 2 braids. Underneath, in careful letters, Lily had written, Clara. Just the one word, just her name. Not Margaret, not Mrs. Mercer. Clara. She picked it up and held it for a moment, and then she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket and went about the rest of the day. Saturday came. Maria and Ruiz arrived with food. Dora arrived with opinions. Margaret arrived last, standing at the door for a moment before coming in. And the evening was not comfortable exactly, but it was real. The mix of people who had come to inhabit this small corner of the world sitting around a table, eating food that was better than any of them had made individually, talking about things that mattered and things that didn't. The noise of the rail yard, a constant backdrop that none of them heard anymore because it had simply become the sound of the place they lived. Wade sat at the head of the table and caught Clara's eye at some point in the middle of it, across the dishes and the conversation, and Lily's animated description of something that had happened at school, and he held her gaze for a moment with that expression she had finally learned to read clearly. It was not complicated. It was simply, this is real, and I know it, and so do you. And she held it for a moment, and then Lily demanded her attention about something, and she gave it, and the evening went on. The hearing was in 4 days. She was ready. The morning of the hearing, Clara woke before the alarm and lay still for several minutes, listening to the sounds of the house. Wade was already awake beside her. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the kind that was held rather than natural. Outside, the first freight of the morning moved through the yard, that familiar low vibration traveling through the walls, through the floor, through the bed itself. She had stopped noticing it weeks ago. Now she noticed it again. The way you notice the ordinary things on days that weren't ordinary. You should eat something, she said. You should stop managing things for 10 minutes, he said. I'll stop managing things when there's nothing left to manage. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That'll be never then. She got up. The floor was cold under her feet. She dressed in the dark with the efficient movements of a woman who had been dressing in cold rooms her entire life and did not require light for it. By the time she reached the kitchen, the stove was lit and the coffee was on, and she was already thinking through the shape of the day. Belle had prepared her for what the hearing would look like. Judge Calloway, finally back from the land dispute east, would preside. Pratt would present the petition. Belle would respond. Both parties would have the opportunity to speak. Margaret had met with Belle twice in the preceding week, and Belle had come away from the second meeting with the measured optimism of a man who had seen worse situations resolve better than expected. She'll hold, Belle had said. He was a compact man in his 60s with a careful manner and the habit of stating things twice when he wanted to be sure they'd landed. She'll hold. She understands what's at stake, and she's not doing it because anyone pressured her. That matters. A witness who's been pressured is a witness who breaks. The question of whether Margaret would hold was the question Clara had been living with for the past 2 weeks. She had not pressed it again after that conversation at Dora's. She had invited Margaret to Saturday supper, and Margaret had come, and they had sat at the same table and talked around the edges of the thing without addressing it directly. And at the end of the evening, Margaret had helped clear the plates without being asked, and had said goodnight to Lily with a naturalness that surprised Clara, who had not known Margaret to be easy with children. Lily had shown Margaret one of her drawings. It was the one of the two figures, the tall one and the small one with braids. And Margaret had looked at it for a moment and then looked at Clara across the room with an expression that was complicated and quiet and not entirely readable. She had not said anything. She had folded her coat over her arm and walked back to Dora's in the dark. Clara poured the coffee and listened to Lily beginning to move around in her room, the small thumps and shuffles of a child assembling herself into the day. She had told Lily the night before that there was going to be a hearing today about the marriage, about the legal situation, and that it was going to be fine. She had said fine and then corrected herself almost immediately, because Lily was 9 and had already learned what it meant when adults said fine in that particular way. It's going to be hard, she'd said instead, and then it's going to be over, and then we'll know what comes after. Lily had considered this. Do you know what comes after? Not exactly, but I know what I want to come after. That's different from not knowing anything. Lily had seemed to find this acceptable. She was, Clara had come to understand, a child who could tolerate uncertainty better than she could tolerate being lied to about it. She'd had enough of the second thing in her short life to have developed a strong instinct for when it was happening. Wade came into the kitchen dressed and looking like he hadn't slept especially well, which he hadn't. Clara handed him coffee without comment. He drank half of it standing up, looking out the window at the gray pre-dawn light over the yard. Belle is meeting us at the hall at 9, he said. I know. Patterson is coming. She turned to look at him. From the northern office? He said he wanted to be there. Wade's voice was neutral. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know yet. She thought about it. Patterson coming could mean he wanted to see the situation resolved in Wade's favor before making any personnel decisions. Or it could mean he was there to witness the outcome and act accordingly. There was no way to know until it was done. All right, she said. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her school dress, braids already done. She had started doing them herself in the last few weeks. The results uneven, but determined. She looked at both of them with that careful reading expression. Mrs. Ruiz said I can stay with her today, Lily said. She said she'd make tamales. That was kind of her, Clara said. I asked her to, Lily said. She was matter-of-fact about it. I didn't want to go to school today, and I didn't want to come to the hearing because I didn't want to cry in front of people. I don't know well. She paused. Is that all right? Wade looked at her with the expression Clara had come to recognize as the one he couldn't fully control. The one that arrived when Lily did something that reminded him of how much she had grown in the particular direction of taking care of herself because she'd learned she sometimes had to. That's perfectly all right, he said. The hearing was held in the town hall, which was also used for town meetings and occasional dances and the quarterly visit of the circuit preacher, and which smelled permanently of sawdust and old wood and the accumulated events of a community that had been using the same space for many purposes for many years. It was not a courtroom. It had no jury box, no elevated bench. Judge Calloway sat at a table at the front of the room, and the parties sat at tables facing him, and the chairs arranged along the walls were occupied by the public, because this was the kind of matter the public attended. Clara had known the town would come. She had counted on it, in fact, as part of how this played out. The people who knew her, who had seen 9 weeks of her work and her presence, sitting in the room while the case was made and the countercase was made. She had not orchestrated this in any manipulative sense. She had simply gone about her life honestly for 2 weeks and trusted that what was real would read as real to the people who had witnessed it. She came in with Wade and Belle and found seats. She was aware of the room filling behind her without turning to look. She heard Dora's voice, then Ruiz's. Amos Geller settled into a chair with a creak of wood. The justice of the peace was in the front row with the expression of a man maintaining careful official neutrality. Pratt was already there. He had his papers arranged with the precision of a man who had done this many times and believed in preparation as performance. He nodded to Belle with the professional courtesy of opposing counsel and gave Clara a look that was brief and assessing and entirely without apology. She met it without looking away. Margaret was in the back of the room. She had come alone, without Pratt, which was itself a statement. She was sitting very straight in a chair against the wall, her coat still on, her hands in her lap. When Clara looked at her, she gave a small, barely perceptible nod. Clara turned back to face the front. Judge Calloway called the proceeding to order at 9:09, which was 9 minutes later than scheduled, and began with a brief characterization of the matter before him that was scrupulously factual and gave no indication of which direction he was leaning. He was a gray-haired man with a deliberate manner and the kind of face that had settled, over years, into an expression of permanent, careful attention. Clara found herself grateful for that. She did not want a judge who arrived with a direction. She wanted one who listened. Pratt presented first. He was good at it, organized, measured, building his case in the way that Belle had anticipated, from the verified fact of the false name in the registry outward to the legal argument about fraud and misrepresentation. He did not attack Clara personally. He referred to her consistently as the respondent and kept his language procedural, which Clara had understood was the smarter strategy. Personal attacks invited sympathy. Legal arguments invited analysis. He called 2 witnesses, the justice of the peace, who had performed the marriage, who confirmed the name in the registry, and a clerk from the rail company's administrative office, who confirmed that the original correspondence had been conducted under the name Margaret Holloway. Both testified briefly, accurately, and without embellishment. Belle cross-examined both with the precision of a man who already knew what the answers would be and was simply establishing that the facts were not in dispute. He was right that they weren't. The false name was true. The correspondence was true. Clara had not asked anyone to testify otherwise. Then Belle presented. He began with Wade. Wade gave his account directly and without ornament. The correspondence, the arrival, the weeks that followed, the moment Clara had told him the truth in the kitchen. He described the timeline clearly. He had known the truth before Pratt had filed his petition. He had chosen, with full knowledge, not to seek annulment. Why? Calloway asked. It was not Pratt's question. The judge had asked it himself, leaning forward slightly. Wade was quiet for a moment. Clara did not look at him. She looked at her hands on the table. Because what she'd built here was real, Wade said. Whatever name she came with, the name was wrong. Everything else was what it was. The room was very quiet. Pratt objected on procedural grounds. That informed consent after the fact did not necessarily remedy fraud at inception. Belle countered with the territorial statute on marital continuance under conditions of mutual consent, and there was a brief exchange of legal language that Clara followed at about half comprehension and trusted Belle to be managing correctly. Calloway listened to both and made a note. Then Belle called Clara. She stood. She walked to the chair beside the judge's table and sat down and looked at the room for the first time since the proceeding began. It was fuller than she had expected. Most of the chairs were occupied. She saw faces she knew and some she didn't. She saw Patterson, Wade's supervisor, sitting in the third row with the composed expression of a man who was reserving judgment. She saw Ruiz, who gave her a small nod. She saw Dora, who gave her nothing, just that steady, sharp gaze that meant, I'm watching and you're doing fine. Belle asked his questions carefully, the ones they had prepared. She answered them the same way she had answered Wade that night in the kitchen, plainly, without softening the truth and without dramatizing it. She had come with a false name. She had known it was wrong. She had not told Wade immediately because she was afraid of losing the only situation available to her. She had told him as soon as her sister's arrival made the timeline unavoidable. "Do you regret it?" Belle asked. It was not strictly a legal question. He had told her he might ask it, and they had discussed whether it was useful. "Which part?" she said. Belle had told her to say yes and move on. She had told him she couldn't say yes to the whole of it because the whole of it included things she didn't regret. And he had sighed in the way of a lawyer managing a client with inconvenient honesty and said, "Then say what you mean, precisely." "I regret the name," she said. "I regret not telling him that first day. I regret that Lily found out from a thin wall instead of from me directly. Those are real regrets, and I don't have excuses for them." She paused. "I don't regret coming here. I don't regret the 9 weeks. I don't regret what I've tried to build. The manner of my arrival was wrong. What I've done since I arrived has been as true as I know how to be." The room held that for a moment. Pratt cross-examined her. He was precise and not unkind, which was more unsettling than hostility would have been. He established again, clearly, that she had signed the registry under a name that was not hers. He asked whether she had intended, at any point prior to her sister's arrival, to inform Wade of the deception. She said yes. He asked when. She said she had not identified the specific moment. He let the silence after that speak for itself. He was good at his job. She acknowledged this to herself without letting it show on her face. Then Belle called Margaret. The room shifted. That subtle change in collective attention that happened when something expected finally arrived. Margaret walked from the back of the room to the front with the composure she maintained as a matter of habitual practice, and Clara watched her come and felt a complicated mix of things that she did not try to sort into a hierarchy. Belle's questions were specific and narrow. He did not ask Margaret about her feelings or her relationship with her sister or anything that invited the kind of emotional testimony that could go wrong in multiple directions. He asked her about facts. Had Margaret Holloway accepted another arrangement prior to the departure of the train from Chicago? "Yes," Margaret said. Had she been deceived about the nature of that arrangement, or had she entered it willingly? Willingly. Had she traveled to Blackstone Junction with the intention of fulfilling the original marriage arrangement? Margaret paused. "No," she said. "I traveled here at the direction of my mother's legal representative. I did not come here to pursue a marriage arrangement I had already chosen to leave." "Thank you," Belle said. "No further questions." Pratt stood for cross-examination. He was careful. He knew what he had and what he didn't. He probed the timeline, the nature of the alternative arrangement, whether Margaret had formally released her interest in the original correspondence before her sister's departure. The answers were all consistent with what Belle had established. Margaret was steady. She had the particular composure of a woman who had decided something and was not going to be moved from it, and Clara recognized it because it looked in that moment a great deal like herself. When Pratt finished, he sat down with the expression of a man who had not broken his witness and knew it. Calloway made notes for several minutes. The room waited. Outside, a train moved through the yard. That distant, familiar vibration, traveling through the floor of the hall, through the legs of the chairs, through everybody sitting in them. "I'll hear closing statements," Calloway said. Pratt made his. It was disciplined and returned repeatedly to the singular fact of the fraudulent registry entry and the principle that fraud at inception was not remedied by subsequent conduct, however positive that conduct might be. He was right, Clara thought, that this was his strongest ground. If Calloway agreed with that principle, nothing else would matter much. Bell made his. He argued that territorial law on marital continuance was specifically designed to address situations where both parties, with full knowledge, elected to maintain an arrangement originally entered into under imperfect conditions. He cited the relevant statute number twice. He argued that the petitioner had failed to demonstrate material injury since she had voluntarily withdrawn from the original arrangement prior to any fraud occurring on Clara's part. He argued that the totality of the situation, 9 weeks of a functioning household, a maintained child, an organized community life, a husband who had elected with full knowledge to remain, constituted precisely the kind of circumstance the law was designed to protect rather than dissolve. He spoke for 11 minutes. Clara counted. Calloway took 30 minutes to deliberate. He went into the small room behind the table at the front of the hall, and the door closed, and the room waited with the particular quality of a group of people who had nothing to do but sit with what they'd heard. Wade reached under the table and found her hand. He didn't say anything. He just held it. She held it back. When Calloway came back, he settled into his chair and arranged his papers and looked at the room for a moment with the expression of a man who understood that what he was about to say would be carried out of this hall and become part of the permanent record of this town's understanding of itself. The petition filed by Mr. Pratt on behalf of the claimed aggrieved party is denied, he said. His voice was level and carried easily to the back of the room. The evidence before me does not establish material injury to the petitioner, who by her own testimony had voluntarily relinquished her interest in the original arrangement prior to the events described. The evidence further establishes that the respondent husband was fully informed of all relevant facts before the petition was filed, and elected with that knowledge to maintain the marriage. Under Territorial Statute 47, Section 3, an informed election to maintain a marriage by both parties constitutes legal continuance regardless of the conditions of inception. He paused. The marriage between Wade Mercer and Clara Holloway, under which name the wife shall be correctly recorded in the amended registry, is recognized as valid and continuing under the laws of this territory. He closed his folder. We're adjourned. The room moved. Clara sat still for one moment in the middle of it, in the middle of the sound of chairs and voices and the particular noise of a room releasing a collective breath, and felt the specific sensation of a thing that had been suspended for weeks, finally landing on solid ground. Wade's hand was still holding hers. Clara Holloway, he said. Just her name. Not a statement, not an announcement, just her name, said in the same voice he used for things he wanted to be accurate about. That's me, she said. He almost smiled. It was not the full version. He was not a man who deployed expressions freely, but it was the direction of one, and she had learned to read the direction. Then Dora was there, and Ruiz and Amos Geller, with his characteristically understated nod that she had come to understand meant approval, and the hall became the kind of noise that was people rather than procedure, and she stood in the middle of it and received it without either deflecting or performing gratitude she didn't feel. She felt it. That was the thing she hadn't prepared for, how much she felt it. Across the room, she saw Pratt collecting his papers with the professional equanimity of a man who had lost cases before and would lose them again. He caught her eye briefly, gave a small nod that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite apology, and left. That was, she thought, probably the last she would see of him. Patterson was still in his chair. He had not moved during the noise. He was watching Wade, who was on the other side of the room talking to Belle with the particular manner of a man accepting a good outcome without yet fully believing in it. Clara went to Patterson. She had not planned this. It was an impulse, and she had learned not to always suppress impulses when her read of a situation was clear. Mr. Patterson, she said. He looked at her. He was a careful man. She could see it in the way he assembled himself before speaking. Mrs. Mercer, he said, and the name was deliberate. She heard that. I want to say something to you directly, she said. Wade didn't ask me to, and he doesn't know I'm doing this. But you came here today to see how this resolved, and now you've seen it, and I want you to know what you actually have in the man who runs your junction. Patterson waited. He knew the truth about my name before the petition was filed, she said. He had grounds to seek annulment, and he didn't. He consulted a lawyer, he spoke to you honestly, and he managed the situation, the legal complication, the public attention, the effect on the yard, without it affecting his work by a single observable degree. I watched him do it. I know what it cost him. She held Patterson's gaze. Whatever you are here to assess, that's the assessment I would give you. Patterson studied her for a moment. He had the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't been prepared for and was deciding whether he respected or resented it. You're direct, he said. I've learned to be. He was quiet for another moment. Then, the junction's been running well. The Eastern Division numbers are up since he came back from the city last year. I'm aware of what I have. He stood. I didn't come here to remove him, Mrs. Mercer. I came here because a man in charge of that junction needs to have the community's trust, and I wanted to see whether he still had it. He looked around the room. He does. He put on his hat and left. Clara stood for a moment and let that settle. Then she went to find Wade. Margaret left Blackstone Junction 2 days later. Clara walked her to the station. It was not a long walk, and neither of them had a great deal to say, which was not uncomfortable in the way that absence of words between strangers was uncomfortable. They had arrived at some kind of understanding in the past weeks that did not require constant articulation. At the platform, waiting for the eastbound, Margaret stood with her traveling bag and looked at the tracks running away into the distance. "What will you do?" Clara said. "I don't entirely know." Margaret said it without distress, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a person who has made a choice and is living with the consequences of it. "Helene will be angry, she'll get over it or she won't. Either way, I need something that's mine." "You could write," Clara said, "about what you want, what you're willing to do, what you're able to do. I'll write back." Margaret looked at her. "You want to correspond with me." "You're my sister," Clara said. "Whatever else has been true about our family, that part is true." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The eastbound whistle sounded in the distance. The train still a mile out, but announcing itself, the way trains did. "I told the truth in that room," Margaret said. "I want you to know I didn't do it because I calculated that it was in my best interest, though it probably was. I did it because it was true, and I was tired of being managed into the version of truth that suited Helene's purposes." She paused. "I'm not sure I've ever done that before. Just told the truth without calculating it first." "How did it feel?" Margaret considered. "Frightening," she said. And then after, lighter. Like I'd put something down I hadn't realized I was carrying. The train was visible now, coming in from the east, its smoke rising in the clear morning air. "Write to me," Clara said. Margaret picked up her bag. "I'll think about it," she said, which Clara had come to understand from 9 weeks of living beside a man who expressed things in exactly those terms was not a dismissal. It was a genuine statement of intention. She would think about it. That was real. The train pulled in. Margaret boarded without looking back, which Clara understood was not coldness, but simply the way Margaret managed transitions. Quickly, without prolonged ceremony, because ceremony made things harder rather than easier. The train sat for 4 minutes. Then it moved. Clara watched it until it was out of sight. Then she turned and walked back through town toward the house. The amended registry entry was recorded on the first Friday of the following month. It was a quiet administrative act, a correction to a document, Clara's true name written into the official record of Blackstone Junction in the precise hand of the territorial clerk. She was not present for the writing of it. It happened in an office by a clerk, in the ordinary course of paperwork. But Belle sent word when it was done, and she sat with that knowledge for a while in the kitchen that afternoon, the sun coming through the window at the angle it came at that time of year, making a rectangle of light on the floor. Clara Holloway Mercer, in the record, her name. She thought about the woman who had stood in Helene's parlor holding a train ticket, afraid of everything, going anyway because there was no better option. She thought about what that woman had understood, and what she hadn't. She had understood that she was going somewhere with nothing but her own capabilities and whatever she could learn along the way. She had not understood that capabilities and willingness to learn were, in the final accounting, close to sufficient. Not comfortable, not without cost, but sufficient. She did not think she was exceptional. This was important to be clear about, in the way it was important to be clear about most things. She had not succeeded here because she possessed some rare quality that other women lacked. She had succeeded, to whatever extent she had succeeded, because she had shown up and paid attention and done the work that was in front of her and not run from the things that were hard. These were not rare qualities. They were available to most people. What was hard was maintaining them when you were afraid, when the ground was uncertain, when the name you were living under was wrong, and everything you were building might be taken away. She had not always maintained them. She had maintained them imperfectly, with failures and delays, and at least one significant deception she would not be able to fully undo. The marriage had started with a lie. That was not a thing that became untrue because the ending had come out well. She would carry that, the way people carried the things they'd done that were genuinely wrong. Not as punishment, not with ongoing self-flagellation, but as a fact, a weight that reminded you what you were capable of under pressure, and therefore what you needed to watch in yourself. Lily came home from school at 3:30, dropped her bag at the door in the way she always did. Clara had given up on the hook. The bag was always going to land on the floor, and came into the kitchen and said, "Bell sent something." Clara looked up. "I know. He sent word this morning." Lily sat down at the table. "The registry?" "Yes." Lily was quiet for a moment. She pulled one of her drawings toward her and looked at it. A recent one, a more ambitious scene than her earlier work, figures in a room that was clearly their kitchen, the light suggested by lines coming through a suggested window. She had been getting better fast, in the way of a child who practiced something daily with complete commitment. "So it's official," Lily said. "It's official. Clara Mercer. Clara Holloway Mercer, in the record." Lily considered the drawing. "Do you feel different?" Clara thought about it honestly. "Not different," she said. "The same, but with something settled that wasn't settled before." "Like when you fix a fence post," Lily said. "The fence was standing, but now it won't blow over." Clara looked at her. "Yes," she said. "Exactly like that." Tis. The summer passed. The rail line expanded 20 miles south, which meant more work and more men and more of the organized chaos that accompanied growth. And Wade managed it with the competent steadiness that Clara had come to understand was his primary professional quality. Not brilliance, not exceptional vision, but reliable, unflappable management of complicated moving parts. Patterson sent a letter in August acknowledging the quarterly numbers. It was a brief letter, professionally worded, but the tone of it was different from what Clara imagined earlier letters had sounded like. Clara organized the women of the rail yard workers' households into a rotating system for managing care during injuries and illness, which was not a formal organization and had no name and operated entirely through the kind of practical mutual agreement that didn't require ceremony to function. Maria Ruiz was its operational center, whether she wanted the role or not. Dora was its institutional memory. Clara was the one who tracked the books, because books were what she knew. She received a letter from Margaret in September. It was short, 2 pages, careful, a little stiff, the letter of someone who was not accustomed to correspondence with emotional content and was working at it. She had left Chicago. She had found a position in a household in Cincinnati as a bookkeeper for a merchant family, which she said was boring and occasionally interesting and entirely her own. She did not mention Helene. She asked about Lily. Clara wrote back. It was longer than Margaret's letter. She told her about the fence post conversation, about the expanded rail line, about the garden, which had done better than expected this summer. She told her that Lily had started proper drawing lessons with a woman in town who had trained as a painter before she married a railman and came west, and that Lily's horses had begun to look like actual horses, which was something to see. She did not write about what it felt like to have her own name on things, in documents, in the ordinary record of a life being lived in a specific place. That was not the kind of thing she had learned to write yet. But she thought about it. Fall came and the mornings came cold, and Clara started keeping the stove going earlier, and the house was warmer than it had been the previous winter because she had thought ahead about the wood supply in a way that hadn't been managed before. Small differences. The specific texture of things being slightly better than they had been. Not because anything dramatic had changed, but because someone was paying consistent attention. There was a night in October when the 3 of them were in the sitting room after supper. Lily drawing at the table by the lamp, Wade reading something from the rail office, Clara mending a shirt that needed mending, and the freight went through the yard with its familiar vibration, and a cold wind pressed against the windows, and the lamp made its ordinary light, and Clara looked up from the mending and saw that this was simply her life, the one she was living, the one that had started with a stolen name and a train ticket, and the specific terror of a woman who had no better options. She had not intended to love it. She had not arrived here intending anything beyond survival, but intentions were, she had learned, a smaller part of the story than most people believed when they were starting out. You intended things and then life shaped itself differently. And the question was not whether your intentions were fulfilled, but whether you showed up for what was actually in front of you. She had shown up, imperfectly, with failures she owned and would keep owning, but she had shown up. Wade looked up from his papers and caught her looking. He did not ask what she was thinking. He had learned, as she had learned about him, that some expressions were readable without translation. He went back to his papers. She went back to the mending. Lily drew a horse that looked like a horse, and the wind pressed against the windows, and the lamp made its ordinary light, and outside the last freight of the night moved through the yard and headed west into the dark, and the house held. Chet. There is something that is easy to misunderstand about the lives of people who survive difficult beginnings. From the outside, the survival can look like an achievement, something accomplished, a finish line crossed, a problem resolved, and it is those things. But it is also simply the beginning of the ordinary, which is itself the harder and more important part. Clara Mercer lived in Blackstone Junction for the rest of her life. She did not have a life free of difficulty. The railroad had hard years and good years. A drought in the third summer strained the household and the community and tested the patience of everyone who had built something with the expectation that persistence would eventually be rewarded. Lily grew up and had her own complications, her own wrong turns, her own things to work through that were not so different from what her stepmother had worked through because these things moved through families in ways that didn't always announce themselves. There were nights when Clara lay awake and felt the specific weight of the things she had done that she could not undo. The false name in the original registry, corrected but not erased. The weeks she had let pass without telling Wade the truth, each one a choice she'd made that she couldn't take back. She did not torture herself with these things, but she did not pretend they weren't there either. She had come to believe that the honest accounting of what you'd done wrong was not the same as punishment. It was simply the record, the thing that kept you accurate about who you were and what you were capable of, so that you could do better with what came next. What she understood at the end of it was this: belonging is not given. It is not a quality you are assigned at birth or a status conferred on you by circumstance. It is built the way anything real is built, slowly, out of ordinary materials, with imperfect hands. The name she arrived with was wrong. The name did not build the belonging. The work built it. The attention built it. The willingness to be known fully, not the flattering version, not the managed version, but the true version, with the errors visible. That was what built it. She had been afraid, for a long time, that the truth would destroy what she had. The truth had not destroyed it. The truth had been, in the end, the only thing that made it solid enough to stand on. This is not a lesson that makes fear easier to manage when you are in the middle of it. She knew that. She had been in the middle of it, and the knowledge that it would eventually be all right had not made the fear smaller. What made the fear smaller was doing the next thing that needed doing, and then the thing after that, until you looked up one October evening in a warm room and discovered that you were, without quite having noticed the moment it happened, home. The freight moved through the yard. The lamp made its light. The house held.